All right, thanks, Holger. I use Wardley Maps for our futures work, primarily in combination with scenarios. And what I say to people is that the purpose of looking at the future is to disturb the present. If you're not disturbing the present or changing things, then thinking about the future is only daydreaming. Now, having said that, I'm very strongly also of the view that you cannot get perfect at that. You can get better at it, and I think Wardley Maps helps people get better at it. But you're still going to not be perfect by any means. So one thing I say to clients is that if you want a 10-year or 15-year view of your industry or your organisation, that's a good thing to do because you're thinking about all the factors that might change. But I will only guarantee you one thing, and that is it will be wrong. And that's because there are so many complicated factors that it's impossible to accurately predict everything. So what we try and do is work with people to get multiple pictures and use the Wardley mapping underneath that to track that. So if anybody wants to contact me, that is my Twitter handle. That's probably the best way to get hold of me. Or you can contact us through our website at www.emergentfutures.com. And happy to answer any questions because of the time difference. So what I'm going to do today is this. I'm going to talk a little bit about a crash repair story that illustrates what I'm trying to talk about. I'm then going to talk about the model we use in sort of a bit of theory about how we use it. And then I'm going to give three examples, one of a farm-to-consumer meat company, one of a regional branding effort by sheep and goat industry in Queensland here in Australia, and one about a veterinary telehealth program to illustrate different ways that we use this and show you some practical maps. So crash repair industry story may seem a long way from Wardley mapping for anticipation, but it does illustrate, I think, very clearly at a simple level what I do. And it's about me speaking to a conference about 4 or 5 years ago, audience of 800 people or so. And I was telling a story about driverless cars. And so I said, in the future, I think it's certainly highly likely that we'll have fleets of driverless cars that will drive us around rather than owning our own cars, and that a company that might have a fleet in Melbourne would need probably 200,000 vehicles to make that work practically, and there'd be three or four other competing fleets. And those 200,000 vehicles, that a company that did that would not be investing just in Melbourne or in Sydney or Brisbane. They'd be investing all around the world. So I said you probably see companies that own 10 million vehicles in that process. And if they own 10 million vehicles, then if they can save only $20 a year on repairs and maintenance, that's a $200 million opportunity. And therefore, they will no longer be going to Joe's local repair shop. They will have massive, probably robotic, high volume, high economies of scale repair businesses on the outskirts of cities where the driverless cars can drive themselves. And coupled with the fact that driverless vehicles will have to have less accidents than human drivers before they'll even be allowed on the road in large numbers, that means the crash repair business is in big trouble over time. So I said to the audience, and I knew there was people from this industry present, then what they should do is think about selling their business. Someone stood up in the very front row and said, my family owns 3 crash repair businesses, and that is the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard in my life. Which was great because I like an argument, and it stirred up the audience a bit, and we had proceeded to have a discussion backwards and forwards about who was right and who was wrong. And after a little bit of that, I said, look, I've really got to go on with the rest of my presentation, which isn't about driverless cars or repairs, crash repair companies. but I'd like to leave you with 3 points before I finish. And first of those is, if you are right and I am wrong, I don't really care, because I have no money in crash repair businesses. But if you are wrong and I am right, you're in big trouble, because by the time you realise it, then everyone else will have realised it, and your repair businesses won't be worth any money. Secondly, I said to him, so what you need to do is hold both those pictures in your head, my picture and your picture of what the future might look like, and continually monitor how you would think about those stories, which might be emerging, what might change your mind. And thirdly, the way to do that is to look at all the factors that might be present in a change story and monitor the signposts that seem critical within those different stories. And so, for example, in this case, it would be people seeking finance for driverless vehicles, people looking at starting up large driverless fleets, research on robotic repairs of driverless vehicles, a whole range of these factors. So I said, if you do that, then at least you'll realise before other people realise what's going on, and you'll have the capacity to sell your business while it's still worth significant funds. So if you do that, and that's essentially what I do as a futurist, I help people think about multiple pictures of the future so they can think about their strategy and navigate and change their way as they go along. So that leaves you with 3 questions. The first of those questions is, if this future came true, what would I do? And the if is really important here, because if you can suspend disbelief and examine the story as if it had happened rather than arguing whether it will or not, that gives you greater capacity to think about the future. Second question is, if this future came true, when would I do it? So in the car repairs case, it would be before everyone else realises. And third question is, if this future came true, how do I know when is, which is the most difficult part of this whole process. So we use scenario planning and Wardley maps together to look at those questions and try and help people think about what their strategy should be. So that encompasses basically what I do. At a more detailed level, this is the model we use for doing that, which is a combination of scenario planning and Wardley maps. And at a very basic level, we use a slightly modified version of a simplified version of OODA loops, observe, orientate, decide, act, where instead of just doing it that way, we say observe multiple future landscapes rather than just the actual landscape in front of you. Orientate yourself to that landscape when it becomes clear. So in the case of the crash repair guy, when it becomes clear that driverless cars are going to change the crash repair industry, then that's time to orientate yourself. Decide, what we say is have a prepared strategy. You'll modify that when the reality happens, but having some thought and some strategy about what you will do in the circumstances is well worth having. And then you still act in the real world. So what's important to me in this process, or the most, valuable part of the Wardley mapping part, is the evolution and co-evolution stages. So I'm assuming here a little bit of knowledge of Wardley mapping in the first place, but I'll go through a little bit of that basically, and then I will show you how we use it. So if we look at a Wardley map, then we see essentially that what it says is that every technology, every business model, every practice, every piece of knowledge evolves from genesis or novel to a custom-built phase to a product phase and then to a utility or a commodity phase. And what I mean by evolution here is that as things move from the left to the right, then a move to a utility phase, you can think about what's happening at that point. And once stuff gets to a utility or a commodity phase, then people build new stuff on top of that utility or commodity, whatever that may be, and the cycle starts again. So if you map out a value chain where you have the customer and the customer's needs at the top of that map, and then you map out a value chain of all the dependent components that meet that customer need, then you can start to think more about how things will evolve and change as you go along. And secondly, the coevolution point, I think, is extremely valuable here. So this is a picture of a manufacturing plant that was powered by a steam engine. And the way that worked was a steam engine was situated at one end, usually on the middle floor. So there'd be 3 floors high and they'd have a steam engine on the middle floor. And there'd be a crankshaft running down the center of that floor and belts running off it. And so they're all crowded fairly close together. The building was designed as 3 stories, so you could run belts to the story below and the story above. And that ran all these manufacturing machines, which in today's sort of, we look at it with today's lens, we would go, well, that's an occupational health and safety nightmare. But it was more efficient being that close. And what happened initially was that when electric power came in, people replaced the central steam power engine with a massive electric source of energy and ran the crankshaft the same way. But over time, people realised they could have smaller and smaller electric motors, which would run individual plants, individual machines in this system, and that enabled the design of manufacturing plants, the design of the machinery, the design of workflows, etc., to change. So the design of the buildings, the design of the way manufacturing was done co-evolved along with the fact that energy that was now a commodity or a utility was changing the way things were done. So we say the same thing about technologies and practices will evolve together. Customer needs will evolve with changing practices and changing capabilities as well. And if you can understand the patterns of those flows, you have an advantage over your competitors. I'm still saying that you'll never get perfect at that, but it does help you do that in a more consistent and structured way that will give you an advantage over your competitors. So I just want to run through 3 examples of client cases that I have used this approach with in terms of giving you different ways of looking at that. So the first of those was a farm-to-consumer meat company here in Australia that turns over about $200 million a year. The board of that company realised that they had been very good at execution. So they had been really, really good over the previous 15 or 20 years at doing really good operational stuff. And that had left them with a very strong balance sheet that allowed them to buy assets when others got caught in commodity cycles and got caught by cash flow problems, etc. The question the board posed to their CEO was, we've been very successful doing that in the past, but that doesn't mean we'll be very successful doing that in the future. So we want to start examining about whether getting better at anticipating change will help us along with our excellent execution. So what we did is we ran a 2-day offsite process with the senior management team, which was partly a new group, and ran them through some scenarios. And I have to say at this point that some of them were a little bit doubtful about some of this process when they started. It changed as we went along, but they were doubtful at the start. So what we did is we created a number of scenarios, one group around plant protein substitution of meat products, and one group around e-commerce direct delivery of meat and other perishables, and examine those from the point of view of how do you think about these things, what is the competitive challenge that you're going to experience. Now, the detail of the scenarios don't matter. I can share with you the maps that we did around the protein substitution because they've allowed me to present that publicly previously. I can't share the ones around the e-commerce because that's regarded as a bit more commercial in confidence. So we took the scenarios and looked at creating a Wardley map around the plant protein supply chain to meet emerging customer need of healthy eating, plant proteins, reduced meat consumption, ego around climate change signalling, other things like that. And we created this map here that said a large part of the supply chain was still going to be in the commodity phase. There were some emerging technologies around manufacturing that was going to affect them, but largely it was a commodity space. We then created a second map where we looked at, well, what happens if those emerging technologies evolve towards the right and become more mainstream, so more embedded as a standard manufacturing process, either as a late-stage product or a commodity inside of food manufacturing companies. And that led to this map, which is essentially saying that everything would have been sort of pushed towards the right in those circumstances and commoditized. And then we started recreating some scenarios with them using the map. So we see some of this process as an iterative process where we go through creating scenarios, then creating maps, then recreating scenarios, then remapping those scenarios to see what happened. And this is the map we did looking at scenarios and strategy and what it meant for them in terms of their competitive position. So down the bottom right-hand side of the map is ringed in blue. There is all of the farm production side of plant proteins if they were produced in Australia. And this showed them that, first of all, this was a commodities process. All of those processes are well known. It was a farming process. They had links into farming, etc. And that it gave them the capability of saying, well, we can look for people purchasing land which is suitable for this. We can look for water purchasing. We can look for contracts. We can do a whole lot of things here that would allow us to see whether this future is actually emerging or not. So that was the first step. Ringed in purple, there is a section that's called byproducts, and it says that if we produce these plant proteins to go into plant protein products, then there will be byproducts. And they immediately got quite excited about this because byproducts were something that they could use to feed their own animals. And they recognised that if they anticipated this change and were able to sign some long-term contracts with the manufacturers and producers of that product, they would gain themselves a competitive advantage. And this was the point at which some of them who'd been, saying this wasn't that sort of good a process to go through and that plant proteins were never going to be a competition problem for them, etc., started getting a bit more interested because the map showed them that there were possibilities for improving their competitive position rather than just being a threat. And lastly, the orange line there joining up is basically an international supply chain that says there will be international manufacturing based on international growth of farm products, and that would be shipped to Australia direct to consumers or supermarkets. And then we constructed a scenario around that said, okay, what if in Australia we have a long-term drought that drives up the price of grain and other food ingredients in Australia, but that doesn't affect what the international prices are experienced overseas? That would mean that the people supplying plant protein products would have a improved competitive price position over domestic production of meat, but also domestic production of plant protein products. So we ran through what that would look like, had discussions about what it meant for them in terms of their hedging policies and what they might do to combat that. So at the end of that process, they were pretty happy that they had a good handle on what this might look like. and a set of signposts they could monitor to think about it. At the very end of that process, after we'd gone through the e-commerce models, which, as I said before, I cannot share with you for commercial and confidence reasons, the CEO in the middle of the process went, "Oh, damn." And what had happened, or I asked him, why are you upset? And he said, because I've just realized that in all the models we've done around the e-commerce futures, we need this capacity. And again, I can't say what that is, but he said, and I've just cancelled the contract doing that 3 months ago and sold off the equipment. So now I'm going to have to crawl back and try and get that contract back and get the equipment back, because I've just realised that no matter what happens, I need that capacity inside our business. So that was a real aha moment for them. And it goes back to those 3 questions I was talking about before. When would I do it, and how would I know when is? Sometimes the answer to that question is well before the change happens. Sometimes it's just about being a fast follower and being ready to go. But that's contextual to the individual organisation that you might be working with, looking at scenarios and these maps. So the second example is I was asked to look at a regional branding project for meat products for sheep and goats in Queensland. And rather than map just what that looked like, we mapped the whole supply chain for goat and sheep farmers for Queensland, and it looked like this. And so what it said was that on the right-hand side, on the top there's a number of customers. There's a farm system in the middle, large parts of which are a commodity. But on the left-hand side, there was significant emerging custom-built stuff around ear sensors, around sensors in paddocks, and around emerging need for information from consumers. So we looked at that map and said, okay, what happens if we looked at the possible evolutions here? And this is a rather complicated map, obviously, looking at it in its first instance, but what we looked at was to say, what happens if satellite internet services evolve to become a commodity and eliminate all the connectivity issues that farmers have? What if ear tags evolve to be more of a commodity, so that rather than being in a few animals in a flock or a herd, to look at what's happening, every animal has a tag and we can monitor it individually? And what happens if sensors inside the farming environment in terms of plants, soil, water, etc., all become commodities as well? What happens there? And then what happens if the consumer need for information and desire for a regional brand also moves to the right and becomes more of an accepted or commodity thing? So we mapped that out without finalising that and removing all the complications in terms of the lines. And what we said essentially is a lot of that essentially moves to a late product or a commodity phase. But the important part was that if you concentrated your investment into the bottom part of the map in terms of commoditizing ear tags and sensors for farms, then you could create a commercial decision-making system that would be viable to sell to farmers on the basis of it would make them money to help them manage their farm operations. And we've seen examples of this already happening in agriculture with companies like Green Atlas in Sydney, who have built a similar sort of system for orchards. So our recommendation to the minister was that the investment should be pushed more into the commoditisation of ear tags and in-ground sensors and crop sensors to push the whole system on farm towards a platform for information collection and decision making that was commercially viable. And that once you had that, then what's ringed in red or orange at the top there which is a regional brand based on consumer demand for information, could be built on top of that information system rather than trying to build a regional brand from scratch. And that it would be a waste of money to build that regional brand without putting the blue part in place in terms of it being a commodity and utility-based decision-making system. So that's a second example of thinking about what happens with evolution, etc., in terms of change and what it might mean for the future map. The last example is one that we did with a veterinary telehealth business. And I'm not going to go through the maps of this, but I primarily want to use it to demonstrate the importance of customer needs when doing these maps and using them for evolution and co-evolution. So this is a veterinary telehealth company that offers after-hours services to veterinary practices. And when we sort of delved down into what the actual customer need was, the first response was after-hours veterinary telehealth services. That's what we're selling. That's what the customer wants. We had quite long discussions with them about what this really meant in terms of customer need, and where we ended up at was that they wanted peace of mind, they wanted vet recruitment and retention, and they wanted brand protection. And the central part, the vet recruitment and retention, was the most important thing for them. So they wanted to be able to say to veterinarians that they were recruiting to work for them, you can come and work for us. After hours, your clients and their animals will be looked after in a very professional way by our after-hours service, but they will only wake you up if it's absolutely necessary. So they will triage all of your patients and they will call on you if you really need it. So you can have peace of mind that you can sleep well at night and not worry about being disturbed unless there's a critical emergency to disturb you. And they saw that as a critical piece of the puzzle in terms of adopting these sort of technologies, because it's a very tight market, generally a tight labour market, but very tight market for veterinarians in Australia. And so being able to recruit and retain veterinarians by offering that service as a veterinary practice was very important to them. So I find it's very useful to go through the 7 whys process, which is to keep digging down and asking why, and then asking why again until people cannot answer the question. So you need a telehealth service. Why? Well, we want an after-hours service. We don't have to run ourselves. Why do you need that, etc.? So keep going down that path until you dig down really into what's going on. And you shouldn't really be building Wardley maps to help with your anticipation until you've clearly identified what the customer need is that you're driving towards, which then allows you to build what the initial map should look like, but also think more deeply about what it might look like in the future when you think about evolution of the components of the value chain that are supplying that customer need, and also what new and emerging customer needs might come from that left-hand side, from that sort of novel emerging side of things. You better understand those if you understand existing needs. So that's how we use Wardley maps to help us in terms of our foresight and consulting work. We help people build multiple pictures of the future so they can hold those inside their heads. We use Wardley maps to look at those landscapes so they can identify the critical signposts of change that they should monitor to see which story might be emerging and when it might be emerging to the stage where it's time to act. We then use the evolution and co-evolution climate impacts on Wardley maps to rethink scenarios in the process of doing an iterative process of rethinking those scenarios. And we coach the customer, the client, in terms of how to use those Wardley maps in terms of them being able to carry out that process, then keep asking us to come back to redo that work. So I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, you can contact me at emergentfutures.com or at futuristpaul on Twitter, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions that you might have.